21-year-old Debbie Carter looked around at the Tuesday night crowd in the Coachlight nightclub where she worked part-time as a waitress. All her tables were taken care of, and the rush of after-work customers had ended at least an hour ago. Grateful for what looked like it would be an extended lull in business, Debbie leaned against the bar, already looking forward to the end of her shift when she could finally get off her feet. As though reading Debbie's mind, Debbie's high school friend and Coachlight regular, Gina Vieta, caught Debbie's attention from across the room, where Gina and some friends were sitting at a table pushed up against the far side of the metal building. As soon as their eyes met, Gina raised her beer bottle in Debbie's direction and then pointed at the seat next to her before mouthing, "Come join us." Debbie gave her old high school friend a big smile, then she checked with the bartender to see if he had any more drinks that she needed to serve. And when he shook his head no, Debbie turned around and then tracked down her boss to see if she could officially go off the clock to go hang out with Gina and their friends. Like the bartender, Debbie's boss didn't have anything for her to do, and so he quickly smiled and said, "Go have fun." Not only was Debbie hardworking, but she was also popular with customers, and she was good at handling any unwanted attention or advances in a way that was direct but not confrontational. So Debbie's boss, who couldn't ask for a better employee, was glad to give Debbie a little break. As Debbie grabbed a beer and walked over to join her friends, the bouncer made a mental note to make sure that Debbie got safely to her car when the Coachlight closed later that night. And that, in a nutshell, was the town of Ada, Oklahoma. It was a tight-knit community. People knew each other, and people looked out for each other, and a lot of people in town didn't even bother to lock their doors, at least when they left their houses during the day. As for the Coachlight, on that night, December 7th, 1982, the popular local watering hole was a perfect example of how the town as a whole had held on to those deep-rooted small-town values despite the huge social and economic changes of the last 8 decades. Gone were the oil gushers and the huge deposits of petroleum and natural gas that had put Oklahoma on the map back in the early 1900s. And while Ada was still home to some small oil rigs that were still operating, most of the rigs in and around the town were rusted and derelict. Since the 1950s, when Oklahoma started emptying out more oil and gas reserves than it was discovering, the town of 15,000 residents had mostly turned from oil to other industries that paid by the hour, like work on pecan farms and in factories and feed mills. But as the county seat of Pontotoc County and one of the larger towns in rural southeast Oklahoma, Ada was still busy. People were no longer making overnight fortunes on oil, but the town was known nationally for horse breeding and for top-of-the-line horse sales that drew customers from all over the country. Ada's courthouse and jail, as well as the town's lawyers and police force, were also busy. They had plenty to do trying to keep up with the ravages caused by the local methamphetamine drug epidemic that had hit so many towns in rural Oklahoma. But even in the face of these changes, Ada was holding its own. A lot of local businesses had moved to the edges of the town, but Main Street was still doing okay. There were no boarded-up storefronts, and neighbors and coworkers gathered for lunch in cafes and sandwich shops. The town was also home to East Central University, whose 4,000 students, a lot of them commuters, helped boost the local economy and bring a little diversity to Ada's mostly white and mostly Christian population. And places like the Coachlight, with its cheap beer, along with food that was more filling than it was fancy, did very well, especially on weekends when it was filled with a mix of factory workers, 20-somethings, and a dance and party crowd who went there for the live music and the big dance floor. On her way over to Gina's table, Debbie had to slow down a couple of times to say hi to a few of the regulars. Even though it wasn't a busy night, there were more than a dozen people at the Coachlight who knew Debbie by name or who had gone to school with her. And noticing that she had stepped away from work, a few of the men decided then and there to see if they could get Debbie out on the dance floor before closing time. Because Debbie was one of those very easy-to-like people. It wasn't just that she was attractive and athletic, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall before pulling on her work boots. She also had an open smile and friendly dark eyes that matched the color of her glossy shoulder-length dark brown hair. In addition to her part-time job at the Coachlight, Debbie babysat, she worked part-time at the local glass plant, and she served food at a local drugstore lunch counter. As a child and teenager, Debbie had never been a huge fan of academics, and her father, Charlie Carter, still liked to tell the story about how Debbie, on her second ever day of going to school, had looked up at her parents and asked, "You mean I've really got to go through with this?" So instead of going on to college after graduating from Ada High School in 1979, Debbie had put all her energy into saving money to buy her own car and rent an apartment of her own. It was a goal that meant she had sometimes clashed with her mom, Peggy Stillwell, who felt that Debbie was spending too much time at places like the Coach Light and drinking too many beers with old high school buddies like Gina. But 2 months ago, Debbie's dream of living on her own, a big girl life, as her family called it, had come true. That's when Debbie had packed her belongings into the 1975 Oldsmobile car she had bought with her own money and moved into her very own 3-room apartment above a garage at 1022 East 8th Street, right next to the campus of East Central University. Once Debbie's mom was satisfied that Debbie had chosen what seemed like a safe location to live alone, Peggy had given her blessing to Debbie, and mom and daughter were right back to being as close as they had always been. And that closeness was true of Debbie's relationship with her father, too. Even though Debbie's parents had divorced 5 years ago, both Peggy and Charlie shared a bond of unconditional love for Debbie and her 2 younger sisters. And since Charlie sometimes picked up a shift as a bouncer at the Coach Light, he was able to keep a protective eye on his daughter without being intrusive. Now, slipping into the seat at the Coach Light next to Gina and a group of their other old high school friends, Debbie stretched out her long legs under the table and sighed with contentment. It had been a long day, and just sitting down was a relief. But even as Debbie exchanged greetings with her friends, her mind drifted to her new home. And just thinking about the apartment she had worked so hard for gave Debbie a thrill. She'd always been someone who liked her independence, and now that she had a place of her own, she loved keeping her cozy living room, kitchen, and bedroom absolutely spotless. And with no one to look over her shoulder, she could eat as many mayonnaise sandwiches, a personal favorite of hers, as often as she wanted to. Even the things Debbie didn't have turned out to be an advantage. As Peggy pointed out, the fact that Debbie did not have her own washer and dryer was actually a blessing. It meant that Debbie made regular trips to her mom's house to do her laundry, which is exactly where Debbie had been just 2 evenings earlier, listening to the tumble of the dryer while she curled up on the bed next to her mom, which is where Debbie wound up falling asleep and spending that night. Peggy, whose motherly instincts were always on high alert, still couldn't help but worry about her daughter's safety in her new apartment. But Debbie had always said, "Mom, as long as I have my teeth and nails to fight with, no one is going to hurt me." Debbie's thoughts were suddenly pulled back to the present when one of her high school acquaintances stopped by the table and asked her to dance. Debbie had always had her share of boyfriends, but she'd never been known for sleeping around. In fact, her closest girlfriends knew that Debbie was very modest and shy when it came to letting anyone see her undressed. But this was someone Debbie had known for a long time that was asking her to dance, and even though she was tired, she pushed herself up from her chair and headed out to the dance floor. But by the time Debbie had come back and ordered another beer, she was already glancing at her watch, just waiting for the night to end so she could go back home. That moment came a little sooner than she expected when her boss started closing the Coach Light early at around 12:30 a.m. Gina immediately invited everyone at their table back to her apartment for one more drink, but Debbie smiled and shook her head. No, Debbie was going to head straight home to her apartment. She promised Gina that if she changed her mind, she'd give her a call. As customers made their way back to their cars, the bouncer made sure that Debbie was not walking out of the nightclub on her own. And after having a brief conversation through her car window with another Coach Light regular, Debbie rolled up her car window, turned on the car engine, and drove out of the Coach Light parking lot towards her new home. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of December 8th, 2 hours after the Coach Light closed its doors and turned off the lights, Gina heard the ring of her telephone cut through the noise of the people talking and laughing over drinks at her apartment. When she answered her phone, she was surprised to hear Debbie's voice on the other end. She was even more surprised by what Debbie was asking Gina to do. According to Debbie, there was a visitor in Debbie's apartment who was making Debbie uncomfortable, and Debbie wanted Gina to drive over and give Debbie a ride to Gina's house. Since Debbie had her own car and could drive to Gina's house, the request made no sense to Gina, unless Debbie's visitor wasn't letting Debbie leave. Gina tried to ask Debbie who the visitor was, but their conversation was cut short by muffled noises on Debbie's end. Gina heard Debbie talking to someone, and then the sounds of what might have been a struggle over control of the phone. Gina didn't wait to hear anything else. She sensed something was wrong. Before hanging up the phone, Gina told Debbie that she would be there as soon as she could. But before Gina even made it out the door, her phone rang again, and again the caller was Debbie. But now Debbie sounded much calmer and told Gina not to come get Debbie after all and that everything was actually okay. Debbie did ask Gina to please give Debbie a call later that morning to make sure Debbie was awake. After hanging up the phone a second time, Gina's first impulse was to ignore Debbie's second call and just still drive over to her apartment to make sure she was okay. But by the time Gina had made it out to her car, she was already having second thoughts. Even though it seemed unlikely, if Debbie did have a man over for the night, Gina didn't want to barge in on them. And Debbie had seemed very emphatic on that second call, telling Gina not to come over. So even though Gina had almost reached her car, she slowed down and then reversed course. A few minutes later, she was back inside of her own apartment, where her friends that had come over were now starting to gather their coats and leave. When Gina woke up later that morning, she completely forgot to call Debbie and check in with her. At 11:20 a.m. on December 8th, that same morning, Donna Johnson headed up the narrow wooden stairway to Debbie's apartment on East 8th Street. An old high school friend of Debbie's, Donna now lived an hour away in Shawnee, but she was back in Ada for the day to visit her parents and to catch up with old friends like Debbie. But just as Donna reached the tiny landing outside of Debbie's front door and had already raised her hand to knock, she felt bits of broken glass grinding under her shoe. And at the same time, Donna registered the fact that the little window in Debbie's door was broken. Even as Donna did reach up and start knocking on the door, she heard the faint sound of a radio playing inside of Debbie's apartment. When there was no answer to her second knock on the door, Donna checked the doorknob and realized that the door was unlocked. As soon as Donna stepped inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. The living room in front of her was a mess. The sofa cushions were scattered on the floor, and strewn across the linoleum in the kitchen off to her side, Donna saw a woman's blouse and a pair of jeans. Even as Donna started to step past the mess towards Debbie's bedroom, she took in the sight of words scrawled in red on the living room walls and on the small white table in the kitchen. But nothing could have prepared Donna for what she saw next. Lying face down on the floor of the bedroom on the far side of the bed, nude except for one sock, lay Debbie's bloody and lifeless body. The bed had been shoved away from the wall, and all the covers were pulled off of it. On Debbie's back, Donna saw more words written in red liquid. Stumbling backwards in horror, Donna suddenly realized that whoever had done this to Debbie might still be hidden inside of the apartment, and a minute later, Donna was clattering back down the stairs outside. Hopping into her car, Donna drove to the nearest payphone to call Debbie's mother, Peggy, who in turn quickly called her ex-husband, Charlie. Charlie arrived at his daughter's apartment ahead of the police and medical personnel. In Debbie's bedroom, Charlie fell to his knees next to his daughter's body. Charlie called Debbie's name twice before gently lifting one of his daughter's shoulders so he could look at her face. A bloody washcloth was stuffed deep into Debbie's mouth. Minutes later, the street in front of Debbie's apartment was lined with police cars, a wailing ambulance, and law enforcement. Stepping into Debbie's apartment bedroom, Ada police detective Dennis Smith took one look at Debbie's body and knew that he had a brutal rape and homicide on his hands. As the 17-year veteran of the Ada Police Department took in the horrific details of how Debbie had died, he also knew that this case felt intensely personal. In addition to knowing Debbie's parents, Charlie and Peggy, Detective Smith's own daughter was good friends with Debbie's younger sister. Doing his best to keep his emotions under control, the 39-year-old detective immediately ordered officers to seal off the immediate area around the apartment from the growing crowd of neighbors and bystanders. After clearing the inside of the apartment, Detective Smith did not waste any time. He sent police officers out to knock on doors and interview neighbors to see if anyone saw or heard anything unusual during the night and early morning hours. He also wanted a list of Debbie's friends, boyfriends, coworkers, family members, and possible enemies. Police would soon find out from Debbie's friend Gina about the 2 phone calls Debbie had made between 2:30 and 3 a.m. that morning, and based on that testimony, they would quickly narrow the time of the murder to some time between 2:30 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. when Donna had discovered Debbie's body. With that information in hand, Detective Smith was especially interested in knowing exactly who saw or interacted with Debbie on the night of December 8th and into the early morning hours of December 9th at the coach light. Since that could include a list of dozens of people, Detective Smith also pushed out a general request for the male patrons of the Coachlight the night before, as well as any male acquaintances of Debbie's, to come to the police station and voluntarily submit hair, pubic hair, and saliva samples. Satisfied that the investigation was now underway, Detective Smith stepped back and tried to make sense of the crime scene, in which all 3 rooms of Debbie's apartment appeared to have been upended by a struggle between Debbie and her attacker. In fact, starting with the shattered front door window and ending with the ripped and torn trail of clothing and furniture, the apartment was so trashed that Detective Smith realized that this homicide might be the work of more than one perpetrator. That suspicion grew stronger as the detective looked at the 4 messages that the killer or killers had left behind. Written in nail polish on the wall of the den was the sentence, "Jim Smith will die next." On Debbie's back, written in what would turn out to be ketchup, Detective Smith read the name Duke Graham. Once Debbie's body was turned over, the detective would see a single word written in red fingernail polish on Debbie's chest, "Die." And on the kitchen table, written in ketchup again, was a message that referred explicitly to 2 killers. "Don't look for us, or else." The names Jim Smith and Duke Graham were both familiar to Ada police. Duke was a local nightclub owner, and Jim was a local small-time criminal that Duke had once driven out of his bar with a shotgun. As Detective Smith, no relation to Jim Smith, completed his examination of Debbie's apartment, he sent officers to find out where both those men were and bring them in for questioning. Then, the detective watched for a few minutes as crime scene techs went about their work inside the apartment, dusting for fingerprints and photographing and collecting possible evidence. That evidence included any strands of human hair, the murder weapon, and the removal of a 4x4-inch square of sheetrock from the bedroom wall that contained a single bloody handprint. The next day, Thursday, December 9th, at 3 p.m., the autopsy of Debbie's body would confirm that she had been raped before she died. Detective Smith was joined at that autopsy by agents from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation who had offered their help and support to local law enforcement. The men watched as the medical examiner collected samples of hair from Debbie's body, as well as scrapings from under Debbie's fingernails, clippings from which were also carefully entered and tagged as evidence. By this point, more than a dozen men had already come forward to the police station to deliver their DNA samples to the police. And it was clear to Detective Smith in interacting with these guys that he was not the only person in Ada who was personally upset by Debbie's murder. One of the first people that police interviewed was a guy named Glenn Gore, who was one of Debbie's old high school classmates who had been with her at the Coachlight before she was killed. And he, like the other friends who had been with Debbie that night, was very shaken up and just could not understand who would want to harm Debbie. And over the next few days, police would hear testimony that sounded a lot like Glenn's. No one seemed to have any idea who would want to harm Debbie. And within days of the murder, police had confirmed that neither Graham Duke or Jim Smith could have been involved in the killing. Graham had an ironclad alibi, and Jim was locked up in state prison. By the morning of Debbie's funeral on Saturday, December 11th, 3 days after her murder, townspeople's fear and frustration only got more intense as mourners filed past Debbie's open casket, because all the makeup in the world could not disguise the terrible injuries to the young woman's swollen and badly beaten face, and whoever had done that was still out walking the streets. Meanwhile, investigators were frustrated by the fact that they had to wait for results from the state's crime lab. Investigators knew that a key piece of physical evidence in the case was the bloody handprint that had been collected from the wall of Debbie's apartment. If that print did not belong to Debbie, it had to belong to someone else who was in the room when Debbie was killed, and that person would most likely be Debbie's murderer. But in the face of growing public pressure to solve a case that was quickly showing signs of getting cold, Detective Smith and Ada's prosecuting attorney, Bill Peterson, decided they could not wait until the Oklahoma State Crime Lab ID'd that print. Instead, in early March of 1983, 3 months after Debbie's death, investigators zeroed in on 2 brand new suspects. This new direction in the investigation was based on unsubstantiated rumors about the murder that were circulating in the local county jail. The first and primary suspect was 30-year-old Ron Williamson, a former minor league baseball player who was one of Ada's well-known hellraisers and heavy drinkers. Ron, who lived not far from Debbie's garage apartment, was fingered as a possible suspect by his county jail cellmate when Ron was locked up on a drunk driving conviction. According to his cellmate, when news of Debbie's murder spread through the inmate population, Ron, who was also known to have serious mental health issues, became very upset. The second suspect, a 23-year-old man named Dennis Fritz, who was new to Ada but who had been seen in Ron's company at some local bars, was a person of interest, mostly because police believed the murder had been committed by two men, and Dennis was one of Ron's few friends. Both men were interviewed repeatedly by police, and both denied any involvement in Debbie's murder. They also submitted fingerprints and DNA to police. Eventually, after hours of aggressive questioning from investigators, Dennis was told he failed a lie detector test, and Ron was told that the results of the lie detector test he had agreed to take were inconclusive. But even after the Oklahoma State Crime Lab reported back to Ada police on March 28, 1983, that the bloody handprint on the wall of Debbie's bedroom did not match prints belonging to Debbie, Dennis, or Ron, Ada law enforcement did just the opposite of backing off that avenue of investigation. Instead, they began to focus exclusively on Ron and Dennis. Neither man had been seen on the night of the murder at the Coach Light, but without any other suspects in the case, Ada investigators doubled down on building a circumstantial case against the men. The case was based mostly on Ron's history and reputation in Ada as unpredictable, occasionally violent, and at times mentally unstable, as well as allegations from more jailhouse informants saying that Ron had had a dream about Debbie's murder. The police continued to focus on Dennis based on their conviction that the crime had been committed by more than one person. In December of 1983, Detective Smith's case against Ron was suddenly strengthened when a customer who had been at the Coach Light on the night before Debbie's murder came forward and told police they had seen Ron at the nightclub that night, just hours before Debbie would be killed. But it wouldn't be until May 1st, 1986, 4.5 years after Debbie's murder, that Ada police got the information they felt they needed to clear the way for an arrest and conviction in the homicide case that had slowly poisoned the once safe and tight-knit little town of Ada, Oklahoma. That was when Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, persuaded Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, to allow police to dig up Debbie's body and re-examine her handprint to see if maybe it did match the bloody print that police found on her wall. If investigators could somehow prove that the bloody print on Debbie's bedroom wall actually did belong to Debbie, then police would no longer have to find a suspect whose print matched that one on the wall. And sure enough, after taking prints from the hand of a 4-year-old corpse, the same agent who had earlier declared that the print on the wall did not match Debbie's prints now revised his report to say that it was inconclusive whose print was on the wall. That shadow of a doubt was all police needed, combined with a hair analysis showing that some of the head hairs found at Debbie's apartment bore a microscopic resemblance to samples provided by Ron and Dennis. Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson were sure they had solved the case. 1 week later, on May 8, 1986, Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz were arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Debbie Carter. For Debbie's family and many other residents of Ada, Ron's arrest came as a relief. Ever since he was first questioned by police back in early 1983, Ron's mental health had deteriorated. His mood swings were more extreme, his behavior had become even more erratic and at times violent. And he had spent all 4 of those years since Debbie's murder in and out of jail on charges ranging from forging a check worth $300 to violating parole to public intoxication. Meanwhile, the long wait for justice had just about destroyed Debbie's mother, Peggy, who had begun to drink heavily and spend hours and hours sitting near her oldest daughter's grave in nearby Rosedale Cemetery. And so, in April of 1988, both Ron and Dennis were convicted in separate trials of Debbie's murder, and the town of Ada breathed a collective sigh of relief. Dennis was sentenced to life in prison, and Ron was sentenced to death. The actual date of Ron's execution was set for September 27, 1994. Ron and his court-appointed attorney would have 6 years to file appeals. Finally, after more than 6 years, Debbie's family could begin to heal, and Debbie, now buried for a second time, could finally be left in peace. As the spring of 1988 blossomed in Ada, the town of 15,000 residents could sleep easier knowing that Debbie's killers were safely behind bars. But all that would change 6 years later on September 22, 1994. Exactly 5 days before Ron Williamson was scheduled to die by lethal injection, a federal appeals judge shocked Ada law enforcement by ordering a stay of execution. The ruling was based on an appeal by Ron's lawyer outlining violations of Ron's constitutional rights during his 1987 trial. But even though that same judge would eventually grant Ron's request for a new trial, the tip that wound up cracking the case of Debbie Carter's rape and murder wide open would have nothing to do with legal arguments about police work. In early 1999, while Dennis was still serving a life sentence and Ron was still in prison awaiting his new trial, Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, received a phone call with news so stunning it would place Ada at ground zero of a national media blitz that would reverberate throughout the town and the Oklahoma judicial system for decades to come. Based on that new information and follow-up work by local investigators and agents from the Oklahoma State Department of Investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Debbie Carter on the night of December 7th and in the early morning hours of Wednesday, December 8th, 1982. It was a slow night at the Coachlight nightclub, and 21-year-old part-time waitress Debbie Carter was grateful that her boss had let her go off the clock. Now, she looked around the table at her group of friends, which included Gina, a Coachlight regular who had asked Debbie to take off her work apron and join them for a couple of beers. On her way over to Gina's table an hour earlier, Debbie had done her usual inventory of Coachlight customers. She'd waitressed at enough bars that it was second nature now to read the room for any signs of trouble from difficult or rowdy patrons. Town bad boy Ron Williamson was not there, and it had been weeks since his friend, Dennis Fritz, had stopped by. Ron was 8 years older than Debbie was, and all she really knew about him and his friend was that they liked to play guitar and that Ron had once been a very popular and promising kid who went on to play minor league baseball for the New York Yankees before an injury had ended his career. Debbie was glad Ron wasn't at the Coachlight. You serve him a couple of drinks and he could get loud and aggressive, and she'd heard that at least one woman back in 1978 had accused him of rape, although Debbie had also heard that those charges were eventually dismissed. But there was still one person at the Coachlight that night that Debbie wished wasn't there. She'd felt his eyes following her when she crossed the room serving drinks, and again when she had walked over to Gina's table. He'd even come over and asked Debbie to dance. She had agreed, they'd gone to school together and they had known each other for years, but when he'd gotten so persistent out there on the dance floor, pressing in way too close to her, she'd actually had to push him away and leave him standing out there alone. When the Coachlight closed early at 12:20 a.m., and Debbie had declined Gina's offer to go to Gina's place for one more drink, there her creepy dance partner was again. This time, he was insisting on walking her to her car out in the parking lot. Debbie had told Mike, the bouncer that night, that this was one of her high school classmates who actually kind of scared her. And when this classmate stood outside of her car and tried to talk to her through her car window, Debbie was glad to see Mike kind of slow down on his way to his own car to make sure Debbie was okay. Seeing her chance, Debbie waved at Mike and then rolled up her car window, turned on her car engine, and drove out of the parking lot, once again leaving her old high school classmate, her creepy dance partner, standing there all alone. Getting dumped like that did not sit well with Debbie's killer, but he knew where Debbie lived, and he'd made up his mind to drop by her place later that night. A few hours later, Debbie's killer was walking the last few blocks of the way to Debbie's new apartment on East 8th Street. He was relieved to see a light on in the rooms above the garage, and a few minutes later, he had walked up the set of wooden stairs to the small landing outside of Debbie's front door. When Debbie's face appeared in the small glass window, her killer took a step back and put on his most reassuring smile. He could see Debbie did not look happy to see him, but he made the most of her few seconds of hesitation, calling to her through the closed door that he just wanted to say hello. It was a cold night, please just let him inside for a few minutes. And just as he had hoped, Debbie did exactly that. Except that Debbie's killer did not leave after a few minutes. And when Debbie picked up the phone and called Gina and asked Gina to drive over and get Debbie and take her to Gina's house, it was all Debbie's killer could do. First, to interrupt the conversation before Debbie gave Gina his name, and then to persuade Debbie to call Gina back and say that everything with Debbie was okay after all. But the whole episode with the phone and Debbie's earlier refusal to have sex with him, which is what he wanted and what he'd come there for, made Debbie's killer very angry. Instead of leaving, which is what he'd just promised Debbie he would do, he waited until Debbie had turned away from him to show him to the door before grabbing her from behind and spinning her back around to face him. When the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Debbie's body 2 days later, at 3 p.m. on the afternoon of December 9th, the catalog of wounds and injuries she had suffered, all inflicted before her actual death, told the story of the violent struggle between Debbie and her killer in the early morning hours of December 8th. Over the course of the assault, Debbie would be beaten, stripped, and raped. In trying to fight off her attacker, Debbie would sustain bruises, scrapes, and small cuts on her arms, hands, face, under her chin, and on the back of her head, along with bruises and bite marks inside her mouth and on her tongue. At some point, Debbie's attacker would shove a bloody washcloth down her throat, and there were traces of shampoo as well as ketchup left on her back and buttocks. In addition to the electrical cord that Debbie's father would see wrapped around his daughter's neck, Charlie would also see the beautiful leather belt that Debbie's mother had given Debbie for her 21st birthday, a belt that had now been used to strangle their oldest daughter. The medical examiner would confirm asphyxiation, lack of oxygen, was the ultimate cause of Debbie's death. After the killer had squeezed the last breath of air out of his victim, he sat straddling Debbie's body for a few moments so he could catch his breath. Then he pushed himself back onto his feet and collected and adjusted his clothing before turning his attention to Debbie's apartment. According to an expert in crime scene reconstruction, Debbie's killer would have spent a substantial amount of time staging the crime scene to make it look like the attack had been the work of more than one person. And Debbie's killer would also use the messages he wrote on Debbie's back and chest, as well as on the walls and kitchen table in her apartment, to divert police attention to two other men, Duke Graham and Jim Smith, who were already known to aid law enforcement. Once he was satisfied with his work, Debbie's killer took a final look around, then stepped to the door of Debbie's ruined apartment. Before leaving, he carefully broke the glass window in the center of the door, so there were bits of glass both inside the apartment as well as outside on the landing. Pulling the unlocked door closed behind him, the killer walked down the wooden stairway out into the cold Oklahoma night air. Later that day, Debbie's killer would go to the Ada police station along with the dozens of other men in town, and he would tell police that he did see Debbie the night before at the coach light, but he had no idea what happened to her. And unlike the 44 other men who would come to the Ada police station over the next days and hours and weeks, Debbie's killer managed to go to the police station but slip away without giving his fingerprints and without submitting samples of his saliva and hair. He would also change his statement 1 year later and tell police that on the night of December 7th, he had seen Ron Williamson at the coach light, and that when the killer had walked Debbie out to her car just after the coach light closed at 12:30 a.m. on December 8th, Debbie had confided to him that she was afraid of Ron. Later still, at Ron's trial in 1988, Debbie's killer would be the star witness whose testimony to that effect would help put both Ron and Dennis behind bars, Ron facing the death penalty and Dennis facing life in prison. It wouldn't be until April of 1999, 11 years after Ron and Dennis were convicted, that advances in forensic science and the real killer's own criminal history would finally catch up with him. Because even as Ron Williamson was filing the legal appeals that would result in a stay of execution just 5 days before he was scheduled to die and the granting of a new trial, Dennis Fritz had been working tirelessly to get a new analysis done of all the DNA evidence that had been collected at the scene of Debbie's murder back in 1982. And by early 1999, Dennis was finally successful. And on January 26th and 27th, new tests conducted by Laboratory Corporation of America showed that none of the semen samples collected at the crime scene and from Debbie's body matched samples given by Ron and Dennis. Later, tests on the 17 hair samples that had also been collected at the crime scene, including one strand with a hair follicle still attached, also excluded Ron and Dennis as Debbie's killer. Meanwhile, even though Debbie's killer had literally gotten away with murder on December 8, 1982, by 1987, he was behind bars serving a 40-year sentence for robbery, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. And in 1995, the state of Oklahoma began taking blood samples from every one of its prison inmates, analyzing DNA from those samples, and entering the DNA results in a brand new DNA bank. With recent advances in forensic science, law enforcement would run DNA evidence collected from crime scenes through that DNA databank to see if any inmates were connected to unsolved crimes. And in 1999, not only would the Laboratory Corporation of America run DNA tests that would clear Ron and Dennis of any involvement in Debbie's murder, they also ran tests against the Oklahoma Prison DNA Databank that would identify Debbie's real killer. When Ada law enforcement were informed about the results of those tests, not only would Ron and Dennis be set free, but District Attorney Bill Peterson would have to prepare for a new murder trial and build a case against his own former star witness who had helped wrongfully convict Ron and Dennis 11 years earlier. But before police could charge their new suspect in the 1982 murder of Debbie Carter, this case took one more unbelievable twist. Around noon on the day that Ron and Dennis finally walked out of prison as free men and drew their first breath of cool and fresh Oklahoma spring air, Debbie's killer quietly slipped away from his prison work detail in the town of Purcell, 50 miles north of Ada. Pulling off his prison work shirt, Debbie's old school classmate, Glenn Gore, the same Glenn Gore who had been the first to go to Ada police and give them his testimony and say, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this happened to Debbie, who would do this to her?" That Glenn Gore melted into the nearby woods close to the ditch he had been cleaning, and when police arrived at the Lexington prison where he was serving his 40-year sentence, they found that Glenn had escaped. 6 days later, Glenn turned himself in on condition that his return to prison would not be handled by Ada law enforcement. In the days and weeks that followed the release of Ron and Dennis, Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson would be completely discredited in the local, state, and national press for their mishandling of Debbie's murder investigation. It would take 2 trials, but on June 24, 2006, 45-year-old Glenn Gore would be convicted of first-degree murder in the 1982 death of then 21-year-old Deborah Carter, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ron Williamson never recovered from his ordeal in prison and on death row. Although he and Dennis both received an undisclosed amount of money in damages for their wrongful conviction, Ron's mental and physical health just kept getting worse. After giving most of his money away, Ron died in a nursing home in December 2004. He was only 51 years old. Dennis Fritz would return to Kansas City, where he would go back to teaching school and living with his daughter, but in 2016, he would suffer a debilitating head injury in a car accident. Detective Dennis Smith would die of a sudden, unexpected heart attack in June of 2006, just weeks after being called to testify in Glenn Gore's murder trial. In 2014, Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, would write a letter to Glenn Gore begging him to tell her why he killed her daughter. Unfortunately, Glenn never wrote back. Thanks to author John Grisham, whose 2006 nonfiction account of the story, The Innocent Man, was an invaluable source of information in creating this episode. Please see our source list for links to other related material. 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop. And it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it. And he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car. And as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs, because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside, and that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops, and she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her, and she turns around and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up, and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. When he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane. There's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was gonna have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's gonna take a flashlight and he's gonna explore the basement, because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box, and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over and she can't move and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open, and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box, and there's writing on it. And all it says is, "This has an odd darkness about it." This really freaked Kevin out because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store. So he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, and then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily, he's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package, he eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table, and just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box, and he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen, and Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb, and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping. And so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep. And so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decide we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday, so he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his black light out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, and he gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool. But they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick. And they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye. And because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, "You just saw that too?" And he's like, "Yeah, who was that?" And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, "We have to leave the house right now." His wife comes downstairs and she's like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car." And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, "Okay," and they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back. It's still locked in the back of the truck. And he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in. And he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it. Because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, "Hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it." And the woman reacted, and she's like, "I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it." And Kevin's like, "Actually, yeah, I did open it." And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, "Release me, release me, release me." Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, they would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, "What do? We've already opened it up." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through.